Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today at the GapSummit and tell you a little bit about the National Science Foundation and what we do in this space. I will say up front, I know that you're coming from 44 different countries, which I think is great. And so my remarks will be a little bit US-centric because we are funded by the National Science Foundation, which is supported by the US taxpayers. However, from my experience working with collaborators in other countries, I think the challenges along the road from basic research in the university to commercialization in industry are somewhat similar in other countries. And so I think you'll see some messages that are useful. And I think many other countries have similar agencies and programs that can help with some of these challenges going along. So if you can't find a program in your country, maybe you can be a little entrepreneurial and try to start one up. But we'll see. So I titled my talk here, the National Science Foundation, Helping Transition Basic Research Results to Commercial and Societal Impact. So you've heard about this gap. I mean, that's the name of this conference, right? So how does basic research funded by National Science Foundation or other federal or government agencies that's done in the university, typically with faculty and students, cross this gap into industry? And there's not only one way to fill it. So the first path, I'll say, is that companies hire the students. A lot of my former PhD students have gone to work in industry, and they bring that knowledge with them into industry, and companies are always looking to hire that talent. So this can be a very efficient way to bridge the gap, but is pretty specific to that one company and that one student. Obviously, another option is you can publish your work. We publish our work all the time, and someone in the industry could read that paper or go to the conference and see it presented and learn about it. So this path is a little bit slower because there's obviously lags in publication, and there can be difficulty in transferring the exact techniques that were used in that work. Another path is to patent the work. You write a patent, and maybe the company will license it, and maybe the university will even get some funding back from royalties. Finally, the student and faculty member might spin out a company, a startup, and the National Science Foundation even has programs to give that small company some research funding to continue developing the technology. The startup could grow, and maybe they get some investment from venture capital or angel investors. And finally, they'll create a product or a service that can go out into the industry, into the broader marketplace. So these are multiple different pathways. There may be others, but I think these are the most common ones. And I think what the answer is there's no silver bullet. All of these are difficult, and they each have their own challenges. And for different technologies, different paths will probably be more important. So trying to fund this gap, or some people call it the valley of death, between basic research at universities and the market, NSF funding really has multiple mechanisms. And you can see the four boxes that we put those in here: educate, accelerate, demonstrate, and translate. So the first, educate, we help teach faculty and students about entrepreneurship and how to work with industry. Second, in accelerate, we help teach them how to do customer discovery and understand if there is a market for their product or service. Thirdly, there's demonstrate, and we offer funding to help build prototypes or proofs of concept. And finally, translation. We offer funding to help commercialize their prototype. So there are risks in all of these areas. It's never a straightforward path or a clear direction. And so in order to help address those risks, that's where NSF can come in with some of our programs. And I'll talk in this slide a little bit about some of the programs, and I'd be happy to answer any further questions during the Q&A, and I'll leave time for that at the end of my talk. So in the first, educate, the risk here is that people don't have the right skills to do this technology translation. So we have a few programs that I mention here. I'll talk about I-Core next, but here I'll mention the intern program. So this is a program that gives graduate students in universities, either masters or PhDs, that are working on a basic research grant funded by the National Science Foundation the opportunity to do an internship of up to 6 months in a non-academic setting. They can go to a large company or a small company, a national lab, even a nonprofit organization or a local government. And this activity that they do in their internship needs to advance the basic research that they're doing in their NSF-funded project at the university. And the supplemental funding of up to $50,000 can support faculty time and travel, as well as the student time and travel and support while they're at their non-academic place. So in Accelerate, the main risk to reduce is the market risk. And here I'll talk about I-Core, which is one of NSF's signature programs. I'm sure many of you have heard about this, but I'll just summarize. It's a 7-week training program that brings together teams of a graduate student or postdoc, a faculty mentor, and an entrepreneurial mentor. This team, over that course of 7 weeks, interviews at least 100 potential customers to understand, is there a market for this technology? And at the end of that 7 weeks, they have a decision, go or no go. If it's go ahead and start a company. You're going to have, the signs look good. It's never 100% success. But we think at NSF that this no-go decision is also valuable, so that this faculty and grad student don't waste the time, energy, and money trying to start this company that probably won't be successful because they haven't identified that market niche. And when they do go back to the lab, they'll have a different perspective on what's important in the marketplace, and their research direction may change accordingly. So in the demonstration phase, there's technical risk. And I'll mention here PFI, or Partnerships for Innovation, that supports prototypes or proof of concept development work by researchers working with industrial partners, really trying to get that next phase from the benchtop to the prototype that might be ready to go out into industry. And finally, in Translate, there's a financial risk because it takes money to get things going off the ground. So NSF offers both SBIR and STTR awards to small businesses. We call it America's Seed Funding. So the government in this small business program does not take any equity in the company. We just give grants to keep advancing that research into commercialization. We see that as an investment in the future of our country. So that's a brief overview of many of our commercialization activities. I hope I've whetted your appetite a little bit. I'll come back and talk about some specific examples later in the talk. But first, let me go back and talk about the National Science Foundation more generally. We are a federal agency that supports basic research and education in all areas of science and education, from A to Z, astronomy, unlocking the secrets of the universe. Did anyone see the picture of the black hole that we rolled out a couple weeks ago? I think everyone on the planet did, which was great. And then all the way to zoology, studying how animals behave, and everything in between. We also run the US Antarctic program with several year-round bases on the continent. So this slide summarizes the figures that are important to NSF. You can see our budget in FY18 was $7.8 billion. In FY19, which we're more than halfway through, we're at $8.1 billion. But the number I'll point out to you is the number on the far left, which is 93% of our budget goes out the door. We don't do any research at NSF. We fund research and education primarily to the academic community to answer fundamental questions, test high-risk ideas, and try things that have never been done before. As I mentioned, we also fund entrepreneurial education and internships in industry. And in addition, there's technical training at the community colleges for people to become technicians. Thousands of undergraduate and graduate students every year to prepare the future science and engineering workforce. There's also the seed funding that I mentioned. Every year we fund about 400 startups and small businesses to do research and development of groundbreaking, high-impact, high-risk technologies. So we're really all about big ideas that someday can change our lives. A couple of years ago, we rolled out what we call the 10 big ideas to inspire our community to go after bigger, grander challenges. On the right-hand side in gray, you see what we call the enabling ideas. These are key approaches to solving big challenges, such as improving the diversity of the science and engineering workforce and coming up with new ideas in the NSF 2026 Idea Machine. There are currently about 30-some finalists in the NSF 2026 Idea Machine. They've all produced videos that are on the internet. You can watch and give feedback on comments. The winners will get cash prizes later this year. So lots of great ideas in the NSF 2026, including saving coral reefs, empathy-based artificial intelligence, and the global microbiome. I haven't had a chance to watch them all yet, but they're all pretty interesting. And on the left, you see the 6 research ideas that we came up with within NSF. And these research ideas really build on fundamental research that has been done over many years, even decades, with NSF funding. So the long-term investments, we believe, have laid the groundwork for the giant leaps that are close, but still out of reach. We think the big ideas are ripe for transformational advances and can also help communicate our activities to the general public. Instead of telling my neighbor that, oh yeah, NSF funds basic research in engineering and biology, I can say, oh, we're trying to understand the rules of life, or harness the data revolution, or navigate the new Arctic. I'll talk more about the future of work a little bit later. And all of these big ideas require collaboration across multiple disciplines, bringing together diverse expertise to address these grand challenges. Progress on big ideas cannot be made in silos, but requires crossing barriers between disciplines. The grand challenges of today will not be solved by one discipline working alone. When the practice of science is rooted or siloed in disciplines because of funding constraints, it limits the potential for discovery. Expanding into new frontiers benefits from the integration of knowledge, tools, and disciplines representing different ways of thinking. Convergence is one of the enabling big ideas that's about bringing together people with expertise in different disciplines. It's inspired by addressing deep scientific problems or pressing societal needs. Convergence requires sustained interactions between researchers from different disciplines in order to produce new frameworks, paradigms, insights, or even new disciplines. When you stop to think about it, it's not too surprising that originally discipline referred to training of scholars to proper conduct and action through instruction, resulting in a set of rules. Therefore, when an interdisciplinary group starts to form, some rules will be broken. This can be exciting for people who like to try new things, but challenging for others. NSF identifies convergence as having 2 primary characteristics. The first is a deep integration across disciplines. When experts from different disciplines pursue common challenges, their knowledge, theories, methods, data, and communities and languages even become intermingled or integrated. New frameworks, paradigms, or disciplines can form from sustained interactions. The second aspect is driven by a specific and compelling challenge. Convergent research is inspired by the need to address a specific challenge or opportunity, whether it arises from a deep scientific question or a pressing societal need. It's not just taking a biologist, a mathematician, and a civil engineer and throwing them in the room together and see what they come up with, although they probably come up with some pretty interesting ideas. We want to see teams that are addressing current national challenges, such as clean water, sustainable energy, or personalized medicine, which I think some of you are thinking about here today, that require these convergent research approaches. From my experience, students are really inspired to work on these challenging problems, but they don't always have the tools required to collaborate across disciplines. Therefore, we also need to make changes in the way we educate students so they're prepared to conduct this type of research. And NSF has several programs in education that address these issues. So research has shown that a common language is really key for building effective communication among team members. It takes time to learn enough about the other disciplines to collaborate in a meaningful way. Unfortunately, sufficient time is not always allocated in the beginning stages of building a collaboration to facilitate this understanding. As a personal example, a couple of years ago, I was talking with a colleague in the Department of Psychology. She was interested in how children control their emotions, and I have a background in control theory, and so we thought, well, we could work together on emotional control. Sounds cool. We were sitting in a conference room writing a proposal, and I drew a graph on the whiteboard of this variable x that was changing over time. She was shocked. She said, variables don't change over time. And I said, of course they do. That's why we call them variable. And to her, a variable in this study was whether the child was a boy or a girl. And that was not going to change over the course of our little study. To me, we were strapping accelerometers to these kids to see how they were moving, and the amount of motion they had was a variable. And if you've ever watched a toddler, that is definitely going to change over the course of 10 minutes, if not a few hours. So to her, the acceleration or the accelerometer measurement was a metric, not a variable, because it was something we were measuring during the study. So even though you think you know what the other person is talking about, it takes time at the beginning of those convergent research collaborations to learn to speak the other person's language and really understand what they mean by the English words that you all think you understand. And that takes a lot of time, as anyone who's learned a foreign language can appreciate, but it can be worth the effort. So we want to see interdisciplinary teams coming together intentionally in novel ways to strategize a research plan that fearlessly confronts these challenges between and beyond disciplinary borders. So fundamental research, we believe, is what feeds new technologies that can improve our health, provide security, grow our economy, and increase our quality of life. New technologies will be part of that solution to many grand challenges. Now I'll tell you another story about one of my colleagues from the University of Michigan. This is Professor Shourya Avtar. And these dots you see on the slide are research awards he got from the National Science Foundation. So back in 2008, he had this brown dot as a career award, and then he had a basic research award from CMMI, this green one. So the bigger dots means more money. And what I'll say is that his research is in kinematics. If any of you are mechanical engineers in the audience, you know kinematics is about as old-fashioned mechanical engineering as you can get. However, he had a new idea to use kinematics for laparoscopic surgery, remap the surgeon's hand movements to the end effector using purely mechanical motions. If you're holding a stick and you push your hand one way, the other end goes the opposite way, right? But he figured out how to remap that, so when the surgeon moved his hand this way, the end effector went the same way. Now, the Da Vinci robot can do it, but it takes up a whole room of electronics and costs more than $1 million. Shourya's purely mechanical device costs less than $500. So, based on this basic fundamental kinematic research, he participated in the I-Core program. That's that tiny little red dot in the middle there. And you can see he and his student, the entrepreneurial lead and their entrepreneurial mentor, and they went through that program and they got this go decision. So he started a company. And then you can see the SBIR phase 1 and phase 2 that he got from the National Science Foundation. And now that company is operating in Michigan with several hundred people producing these surgical devices and selling them all over the world. So he came back to the university and got another basic research award, also from CMMI. And maybe the cycle will repeat again. When I was on campus a couple of weeks ago, I told him I use this example all the time, and I said, so are we going to see this progression again? He said, we'll see. But he does have some really interesting ideas about nano-positioning that may be ready for another cycle through this. So in order to develop that technology for laparoscopic surgery, he collaborated with the surgeon to understand really what were the use cases. Where would it make sense to do something like this? Which specific surgeries will benefit from this type of low-cost technology. So NSF really wants to accelerate that type of use-inspired, convergent research in areas of national importance, bringing together knowledge from many branches of science and engineering, as well as different kinds of partners to accelerate progress on grand challenges. And one way we're doing that is we're launching what we call the Convergence Accelerator. Unlike small business accelerators, these convergent accelerators have the goal of accelerating use-inspired convergent research being done around some of the big ideas. They take some of the key ideas from commercial accelerators in that they have cohorts of teams that work together and learn from each other, intensive educational and mentoring components, and work with strong partnerships involving academia, industry, and government. Although the convergence accelerators will be doing basic research, the outcomes will be more intentional, trying to solve specific problems. By having multiple teams working on the same problems, using different approaches, and sharing both their findings with each other and competing with each other in what we call a co-opetition model, we expect the research to progress more quickly than if they were working in isolation. The strategic direction, which is the problem they're solving, will be set from the top, but the approaches will be diverse, coming from the bottom up. So we want to accelerate research where we can anticipate short-term deliverables with an approach that includes education and mentorship and rewards innovation, risk-taking, and translation to practice. So NSF will provide the organizational support for these convergent teams, bringing multiple teams together around the specific focus, each team with its own approach. The inclusion of external entities as partners is important to broaden the potential for novel solutions. In the pilot phase of the Convergence Accelerator, which launched a few months ago, there are 3 tracks, one related to harnessing the data revolution, and 2 for the future of work at the human technology frontier. I can point you to more details, but since the call has already passed, I just thought I'd summarize that we received several hundred concept outlines to participate in this activity and invited several dozen to submit a full proposal that was due at the beginning of June. We will select a set of teams that will start out in the fall, working with multiple partners to more specifically define their deliverables and have a pitch competition in the winter to down select for the next phase. What you might be interested in is we also issued recently a request for information asking the general public, including you, to suggest ideas for new tracks in the Convergence Accelerator. What topics do you think are ripe for transformational advances with multidisciplinary teams from academia, industry, and government working on convergent research problems with targeted deliverables? The ideas can be submitted until June 24th, so you have a week, and you can look for a new call for teams for the new tracks later this year. I mentioned I'd talk a little bit more about the future of work at the Human Technology Frontier Big Idea. This program treats future work, future technology, and future workplaces as deeply integrated and intertwined elements of our nation's powerful work-based ecosystem. We all know the world of work is changing, and there's a concern about the effects of these technologies on jobs. Some people think that AI and robots will take away jobs, and there is a lot of fear about that. Another view is that the job loss will be offset and even surpassed by the creation of new jobs and industries, as it has been time and time again, as with typesetting, agriculture, assembly, and so on. For any of you that saw the wonderful movie Hidden Figures, you saw the women in the early 1960s at NASA who were the computers, the human calculators, lose their jobs doing calculations when the mainframe computer was installed. But then they learned how to program in Fortran to keep this IBM mainframe solving those problems, and thus they were some of the first into the newly created job category of computer programmers. In NSF's Future of Work approach, worker experiences inform social and behavioral research. This research, in turn, guides technological development. And rigorously evaluating how these technologies affect the workplaces can reveal new ways to increase productivity And this knowledge can in turn fuel more advanced cycles of beneficial technological development. Robots, artificial intelligence will be a big part of the future of work. So I'm going to give you a few ideas of what this future of work might look like from some research we've funded at NSF over the past many years. In the future, we believe that robots will augment human capabilities. Past NSF funding has laid a foundation of discovery in many of these areas. In 1986, which was more than 30 years ago, we awarded our first research grant to Professor Hami Kazerouni at the University of California, Berkeley, who went on to receive a dozen more research grants from NSF before co-founding the company Exobionics in 2005. Nearly 20 years after his basic research grant to starting a company, some things take a long time. As a startup, Exo also got seed funding from NSF to transform their ideas into marketable products. Their exoskeleton for rehabilitation from stroke and spinal cord injuries received FDA approval in 2016, more than 10 years after the company was founded, and is now used in more than 250 rehabilitation centers. It is helping people walk again. Professor Kazerouni brought together ideas from dynamics and control, artificial muscles, robotics engineering, human-computer interaction, intelligence systems, and other fields to make his concept real. He continues to do NSF-funded basic research at UC Berkeley. Recently, the company is offering exoskeletons and vests for industrial settings to reduce strain on people working on assembly lines who continue to do the work that humans do best. In the future, we believe robots will assist with chores so people can focus on the work they care most about. They will work safely alongside of us. Here we see an example from Diligent Robotics. Diligent Robotics is a small company that's created a robot to work in a hospital setting. Professor Andrea Tomaz at the University of Texas in Austin started the company in 2017 after completing years of fundamental research and participating in the I-Corps program. What's exciting about their work is how closely they've partnered with nurses and hospitals. They studied how nurses spend their time to understand where service robots could have the most positive impact. Their robots combine technologies for navigation, manipulation, and learning with human-centered design and ideas from medical professionals and patients. Together, their robots are being deployed in multiple hospitals in Austin, Texas for beta testing. NSF-funded researchers and small businesses are creating the future of work and designing it in a way that benefits people. As I mentioned earlier, the investments in new research from this future of work at the Human Technology Big Idea is just getting started. This project was just funded last year. Here you see a human being in an exoskeleton. Today's exoskeletons help humans transport very large objects and navigate difficult situations, like the ones we saw from Exobionics a few slides ago. But this NSF-funded project is about one of tomorrow's exoskeletons. The device you see here is not just an exoskeleton for the body, it's also an exoskeleton for the mind. This exoskeleton of tomorrow provides information to the worker through an augmented reality system. The information empowers the worker to process information and make better decisions with incredible speed. You may be aware that the Veterans Affairs is one of the nation's leading users of exoskeletons. Imagine the new opportunity that tomorrow's exoskeletons will open for our veterans. NSF's Future of Work program supports this technology by incentivizing technological developers, artificial intelligence experts, and workplace specialists to collaborate and think about how to improve performance, decrease injury, expand access, and increase quality of life in ways that would not be possible if these groups worked in isolation or in silos. So work like this is just the beginning. Last year, the Future of Work Big Idea supported projects in a wide array of work contexts, including healthcare, power grids, farming, learning, scientific research, transportation, emergency response, and manufacturing. We're tracking these projects with great excitement. We received a new crop of proposals in March and are currently evaluating those. We look forward to more groundbreaking research coming out of the National Science Foundation. So thank you for letting me tell you a little bit about what NSF is doing. We believe that our investments of taxpayer dollars in research and education can accelerate the progress and enable the nation's workforce and economy to lead in a future that is increasingly and unavoidably driven by technology and knowledge. Thank you very much, and I think I left plenty of time for questions. Why don't you just moderate, pass the mics.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm curious, you talked about how basic science research is the foundation that allows technology to move forward, and I think everyone in this room would definitely agree with that, but I think it's something that a lot of times is not always fully recognized by the general public. And as an organization whose budget is subject to, congressional approval and political whims, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on what we can do both here and abroad to ensure that people continue to understand and see the value of basic science research and continue to fund that.
So thank you for that question, because I think that is something that we have recognized at NSF. We need to tell our story. And I think, so part of it is we can say, computed how much our $1 billion our budget is and how much impact that has on the economy, but those are abstract numbers. I think these specific stories can go a long ways. I gave you several in this talk, and there are always more coming up on the time. So NSF's had a much bigger footprint, I'd say, on social media. So we now have, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera. And so we're really trying to propagate out our stories as much as we can and encourage our PIs that are receiving NSF funding to also, tell their stories, not only within their university, but, within their communities and make that a bigger impact. We recently came out with a new campaign that just started called Brought to You by NSF. There's this great little video that someone is sitting on the couch and asks Siri, can you tell me some of the new developments that have made possible by basic research? And it goes through kind of everything you do in your life today. And so we're trying to be better at that. But I think there's no silver bullet, right? It just have to tell the stories and try to make the case that everything, maybe not everything, but most things that we do were originally supported by fundamental research, and sometimes it takes a long time. Like the exobionics example, 20 years before you start the company, and then 10 more years before you get FDA approval. That's a long time, and people forget. So we try to keep those stories coming. So follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever your favorite platform is. We're there.
Is this on? Yeah. Thanks for the talk. I just wanted to expand upon that last question, moving from not just communication with the public, but engagement with them. I was just wondering, this was very, very briefly mentioned. You mentioned that there was a kind of call for ideas to the general public. And I was wondering if you could expand upon how the general public are involved, not just in letting them know about research directions and funding decisions, but if there's any work going on to actually involve them in those decisions.
So we did have this call to the general public. We don't have a good mechanism to get to the general public, right? We announced it on social media and things like that. I will say the majority of the ideas we got submitted came from universities. There are traditional stakeholders, but there were some from high school students. So there were, it wasn't only universities that responded to that call. In terms of having people from the general public involved in making decisions, so we're asking the general public again for feedback on those big ideas, but it's not like a popular vote, right? It's just feedback, which is one opportunity for them to give feedback. And we're doing a lot more within our research projects to engage the community. We have programs, what we call citizen science, that works a lot both with high school students and with people in the general community to help take data about things that are happening in their community. And so there are programs like that that try to engage local general public in scientific activities. So you could, Google citizen science at NSF, and you'd see some programs in that. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. You mentioned a lot the importance of convergence and multidisciplinary teams in facing challenges. But what I've seen from my academic background is that in the earlier stages of university education, like in an undergrad level, we're not very exposed in working with multidisciplinary teams. And I think you've mentioned that NSF, apart from the Convergence Acceleration Program, has some educational programs on that earlier stage, and I would be very interested in learning what kind of activities those programs entail as a source of inspiration for my university, for instance.
So thank you. I think we're still at the earliest stages. So all of the research big ideas have an educational component. We have the convergent research, I'd say, is because it's research, is more attuned to the graduate students who are doing research. We've run a few workshops, many of them international, on convergence education and thinking about what that means for undergraduates. I'll just say from my personal experience at the University of Michigan, the students who work on these team projects outside of class get that. They're building the solar car. They need, solar panels. They need, a drivetrain. They need materials. So they get, and then they need to raise money from sponsors. And so they get that from their team project experiences. But I don't think we're as good at teaching it in the classroom. But I think we're moving in those directions. It's slow to change the university. But there are pockets of things that are coming up that give students this kind of opportunity. So you could check. There's like I said, we've run a couple workshops on convergence education, and I believe the reports are online. So if you have trouble finding anything that I mentioned that is online, you can send me an email. I'd be happy to respond. I know Google is great. It was funded by NSF in the early days. That was a digital libraries project at Stanford, and one of the other co-founder had an NSF graduate fellowship. So, that was a long time ago, but it is a great tool for finding things on the internet.
Great. In the same vein, I wanted to talk a little bit about the metrics and measurement of programs like SBIR. While I understand that the SBIR grants are actually not meant to be paid back, how do you guys actually track the effectiveness or the impact that SBIR is having on society?
So at NSF, in terms of, you call it SBIR, we just call it SBIR, but it's the same thing, Small Business Innovation Research. So we do track our SBIR grants pretty closely. We look at, did they receive external funding outside of the government? If they have the phase 2 big award from NSF and they get external funding, we can match that up to a certain level. So we track absolutely other funding they get in. We track employees. How many people do they hire? Are they acquired? Many of them do get acquired. So we track their success through the value chain of a small startup company. I don't have the numbers at my fingerprints, but we do have those in an annual report because Congress is, of course, very interested to know what are the fruits of our investments in the small business program. We feel that the equity is kind of held by the US taxpayers, and when people create jobs and create value in the economy, then that will be good for the economy overall. So it's a little bit more diffused. We're not voting members of their board or anything, but we think it's good for the country. Those are the kind of metrics that we track. Income of the companies, investments by external jobs. So, okay, thanks. And if you can't find it, send me an email.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I was just wondering on one of your first slides, with the knowledge transfer being between academia always to industry, I was wondering if you could speak to the piece of moving ideas from industry back to academia, which are more high risk. For example, there's so much data and high throughput screens, deep biomarker profiling, that industry doesn't have time to explore all these different ideas, and transferring them back to academia who might have the more time to, each one could be almost a mini thesis.
Absolutely, that's a great point. So we have many opportunities for partnerships between industry and universities, and I'll mention, I guess I'll mention 2 of them. So one is called IUCRC. It was probably on that slide, Industry University Cooperative Research Center. And so this is a research center where NSF kind of gives the core funding to pay the staff and kind of make it go, and industry gives the funding to do the research. And they're usually multi-university. And so because the industry is at the table talking about the research needs that they see, these are pre-competitive basic research grants. Sometimes they're even across multiple industries, but they have to have multiple companies, so it's not just one company. So that's that consortium model, which is a way where the industry can bring their data, they can bring their tools or methods to the table for the students to use. But it has to be in that consortium model. So that's one way that would be industry-wide. The other way is more particular, and this is called GOLI. I think that might have also been on the slide, which is Grant Opportunity for Academic Liaison with Industry. And a faculty member can write a basic research award with an industry co-PI. And so the money is from NSF. It usually goes to support the student who's doing the research, and industry can contribute their data through an IP agreement, and then the student or students, multiple, working on that project can work collaboratively with the industry co-PI to address those challenges. So that is a way that, I don't know if you'd say it's transferring it into industry, but it's collaborative research with an industry PI and an academic PI, and usually 1 or 2 PhD students. So those are 2 avenues that we have that would address that. I won't say it's transfer, but it's partnership to advance the research, because really that's NSF's goal, is to advance fundamental basic research. We think it's great to have partnerships with industry because you're right, they have a lot of data that there's no way we could gather that much data in the university, and you're right, sometimes the company doesn't have the ability to really understand the data in the way that the academic research could really shed insight on. Thank you.
Hi, great talk, thank you. Out of the 4 kind of blocks that you covered, the education of the skills gap, if you will, the market research and the commercial risks, the technical risks and the funding risks, which of those 4 do you think is the biggest and perhaps most underappreciated by those trying to commercialize a new technology?
I don't know that there's one answer to that. I will say, based on thinking about the skills gap with this I-Corps program where we train the researchers, people who have gone through I-Corps are 3 times more likely to get their SBIR phase 1 than sort of people off the street, if you will. I mean, they still could be coming out of a university, right? So I think having that expertise and the training, focused training in how to determine the market for your technology, 3 times more successful. SBIR phase 1 can be very competitive. I think the last competition was about 10% funding. But if you had an I-Corps grant, then you were close to 30% for your first time getting it in. And I think if you think about technology developed in the universities, as faculty, nobody taught us how to, start a company. So I think having that educational training was very valuable. If you also remember those dots from my colleague Shoria, the I-Corps dot is really small. We didn't give him very much money for that. It was mostly travel to talk to potential customers. But the education and the insight and the mentoring, I think, is really important. On all those, there's probably mentoring, and having someone has the experience, has done it before. I think those are really hard problems to solve, and hard to solve from a government organization that, But I think trying to build those networks is something that we do, and when we have SBIR awards, we bring them all together in a conference so they can also learn from each other. So, and we have people who did it before come back and tell them what they learned, and so yeah. So I'll say, and I can't say that this is overall, but I do know that is one gap that we realized a while ago and created this I-Corps program to address. We probably knew before there was this financial gap, and then we started the SBIR program in the 70s or something. So, There must be another question.
Hi, yeah, I think we're trying to facilitate a new way to ask these questions, so I'm standing up. I'm also supposed to introduce
Okay,
myself. I will say I think I picked a bad time to ask a question, given that I have to do this now. So my name is Ryan Leung. I'm from the U.S., born and raised in Boston, but I work at Genentech over in San Francisco. I really liked your first slide that kind of talked about pathways for people in academia to be able to translate their research into industry. I wonder if, towards that light of facilitation, you mentioned pathways for co-PIs or partnerships with industry, but I think there's a lot to be learned maybe from models in other countries, such as in Europe, or I know in the UK there are a lot of programs where your PhD can actually be in direct funding or partnership with industrial companies. You don't really see pathways like that so much in the US. Outside of partnering, say, as a co-PI, do you see ways for maybe more direct work or interaction through graduate work with industry partners without, because I think it's difficult to establish a network if you're not already working in industry for an industry PhD, as opposed to being able to start your program in that light?
So that's a good question. I think this IUCRC model that I mentioned, where the industries come to the table and help decide what research should be done, and then they have usually at least twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year, presentations for the students to present their work to their industry partners. I think those are probably the closest collaboration with multiple industries, except for the one that I mentioned, GOLI, where it's a industry co-PI. Industry is funding more research at universities these days. If you look at the trends, I was the Associate Dean for Research at Michigan before I came to NSF. And we were seeing that the best case for federal research grants was probably going to be flat moving forwards. And so we worked pretty hard to work with our local industry as well as national industry to get them to fund more research at universities. And so I don't know the national trends, but I can say that the trends that I have seen nationally is that industry is funding more work at universities. It's still a small chunk, maybe 10%, whereas government is probably 80% nationally. And then there's some foundations and things like that. But I think there is a small trend, and especially when the economy is good. The problem with working with industry is you can have a great relationship and the economy is great and things are chugging along, and then the company goes bankrupt, like General Motors, a big one, and then all bets are off and you have to rethink what you're doing. So I think there are opportunities, but I don't think it's going to be a majority chunk of research going forwards. But I think there are more opportunities than there used to be, say, 15 years ago. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of in that direction. In the back.
Hi, great talk. I found it really, really interesting to hear your perspective. One thing that you're talking a lot about the convergence between academia and industry, which I love. I think it's a really progressive way to work with science. You didn't talk a huge amount about IP, intellectual property, and where that sort of line is drawn, especially between that partnership. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from your perspective about how that supports, or you can struggle with the IP relationships between industry and academia.
So that's a great question. And again, I'll say there's no single answer. For these IUCRC centers that we fund through NSF, there's a standard agreement. And this is the IP agreement. If you join the center, you sign this, or if you don't sign it, you don't join the center. So it's kind of, and I think that makes it easier for the universities. They don't have to negotiate one-off with each partner. This is the model. And like I said, it's pre-competitive, so the companies all receive a non-exclusive royalty-free license to any patents that are generated from the research in that center. And sometimes that works for many companies, and if it doesn't work for them, like I said, they don't have to join. And what I've seen then is when they have that sort of doing the generic basic research, companies can often sign up for another project where they'll negotiate exclusive IP rights, but they pay for the whole thing, right? Whereas this is a consortium model, each company puts in a little bit and they get kind of access to the whole pot. For the GOLI project that I mentioned, where you have an industry PI and an academic PI, NSF won't give the money to the university until the IP agreement is in place. We don't say what that agreement needs to be, but usually universities have a standard template for IP agreements with different companies, and they'll probably use that as a starting point to negotiate. So we need to have that agreement in place. I will say it's becoming more difficult to negotiate some of those, at least from my experience at the University of Michigan. So I think this center model, the IUCRC, where it's a standard agreement, everybody signs it if they want to join, has been pretty successful to get people interested in joining.
Thanks, great talk. My name is Jenna. I'm part of the organizing committee and PhD student here at MIT. So my question is, you addressed that there is a much greater success rate in people moving forward from participating in the I-Corps, moving on to the first phase of the SBIR grants. How does the funnel work after that? What's the sort of yield or attrition rate moving on to phase 2 and then ultimately to FDA approval? And also, you talked about these sort of increasing pots of money as people move along. At what point do people move through clinical trials? Do you facilitate enough non-dilutive funding for companies to move significantly down that pathway?
So most of NSF's work is not going to go to the clinical trials. There's a few, like I mentioned, the exoskeleton. But for rehabilitation, it had to go through clinical trials. But I think to work in the manufacturing lab, in a manufacturing plant, it didn't need to go through clinical trials. So they could get started with other avenues before they went to rehabilitation. So I can't speak to clinical trials because, like I said, a small fraction of I highlighted the biomedical examples here, but there's a lot of other examples that are not necessarily biomedical. But in terms of going from SBIR phase 1 to phase 2, the success rate's about 50%. Because you can't apply for phase 2 unless you have phase 1. So it's not 100%, but I think it's, like I said, around 50%. And not everyone applies because sometimes during their phase 1, they get extra funding. It's still work to write an NSF proposal, right? You have 15 pages and broader impacts. And so so not everyone applies, but I think 50% of the phase 1 awardees will get a phase 2, more or less. And in terms of success rate to clinical trials, I mean, we don't fund anything that has drug development. That's all NIH. So anything, if you think about trying to draw the line between NSF and NIH, if it addresses a specific human disease, it's clearly NIH. If it's not related to health, then it's science and engineering is NSF. And there's some things on this gray zone, right? Like the laparoscopic surgery device, but the basic research was kinematics, and NIH isn't going to fund kinematics. They don't know probably too much about that, right? So I think there's some gray zones in the technology for healthcare, like the robots in the hospital in Texas, right? Do they need to go through clinical trials? I don't think so, because they're not working with patients, but they still have to go through some trials. So I guess I can't specifically answer your question, because we fund so many different types of science and engineering research that's not related to FDA. So we do have a partnership, I should mention, with the FDA, where we will fund faculty or students, I think, to do an internship at the FDA. And there's not a lot of demand for that, but it's more on the technology development side, right? Not clinical trials and drug development and stuff. So that could be, I should have thought to put that in this. I just thought of it as you mentioned it. So there are some collaborations we talk to FDA. Like I said, more on the device development side. I see one last question, or we should wrap. Oh, there's one question in the back. Last question.
One last one. Yep.
Hi, Don. My name is Ipshita. Thank you for coming to the Gap Summit. I was one of the co-founders of the first summit, and I'm from New Zealand and work at McKinsey now. My question was, a lot of us come from countries. I come from a very small country which has a funding of about 680 million New Zealand dollars for science funding over 10 years, which is what you fund in US for a year, which obviously makes sense with how the economy and the size here is. How have you seen, there's three facets to my question. One, the trend of how this funding of 900 million US has changed over time with like different governments and the politics. How have you seen that change with more private funding coming in? Second, how is that distribution made? Because for you sitting at NSF, there are so many basic sciences, there are so many application areas. How do you distribute 900 million? What do you prioritize, what do you don't? How much do you put in there? And thirdly, I think there was a question on this with industrial grants, but what sort of impact metrics, you mentioned jobs, and I also saw some of the metrics you had, some of the input metrics of how many research papers or how many researchers are going through, but what do you have to justify to the Congress every year, FY18, FY19? What are some of the top metrics that justifies the 900 million funding? So it's a big question, which is why I didn't want to ask it before. Would love to hear your thoughts, and obviously would look up any reports that NSF has to the Congress as well.
So thank you. I've been there for 2 years now. I think tomorrow is my 2-year anniversary. So, so in terms of the budgets overall, so last year we were 7.8 billion in 18, 19, which we're halfway through, we're at 8.1. And in 2020, which will start in October 1st, the presidential request is for a cut, but the House has marked up their bills at 8.6 billion. So another 6 or 7% increase. So I have this chart that shows the presidential requests and congressional appropriations over the years, and one message you can take away is that the president and the Congress don't always agree. And another message is over the last few years, Congress has been consistently increasing NSF by 3 to 5%. Of course, that has to go through, both houses have to agree, and then has to go to the president, and he has to sign it. But for the last few years, we've seen small increases. So your second question, I think, was how to appropriate that increase. And what I'll say is the philosophy we've taken is if there's a cut, we try to spread the pain evenly across the different directorates. If there's an increase, we try to be strategic and look at what are the national priorities, what are Congress's priorities, what are the administration priorities, are there ways we can differentially increase things that are seen to be more valuable. Sometimes it might still look like it's going across because we are doing work, even like manufacturing, which you might think of as a national priority. Well, there's biomanufacturing, so that would fall under the biology directorate. And engineering does a lot of manufacturing, and there's a lot of data in manufacturing, so that might be in computer science. So even though we say we're going to increase manufacturing, it will have little trickles in all the different directorates. And then your third question was about industry funding? I forget.
So one was on the sort of trends in the change of funding over time. The second was on how do you distribute between sort of different basic sciences and application areas. And as you said, in manufacturing, there's different...
Just as an example, yeah.
And thirdly was just how do you justify...
Oh, how do we justify to Congress? So again, we try to tell the stories of the impact of our research. And so one of the things that's easy for us to count is, well, we supported, X number of students. That's easy for us to count. And we supported 400 small businesses. That's easy for us to count. Jobs created is a little harder for us. We try to tease that out. And we also try to do the big impacts. Like, well, we supported the fundamental science and engineering and technology that went into building the Event Horizon telescope that created the first picture of a black hole, or the event horizon of the black hole. Like, I don't know how you justify that, but there was a lot of interest in that from Congress. The director went down to the Hill and did a briefing for the House science staff. And some of the members came, just because it's really cool, right? I mean, just generally cool stuff I think they're interested in. So it's a multifaceted thing, but they're always interested to know what we're doing, how it impacts people in their district, in their state, and the country. So I think I'm over now.
All right, well with that, let's thank Dr. Tilbury for her time and her talk.